Today, we're diving into an idea that's gonna completely flip what you think you know about crime. Seriously, it challenges everything. Let's get right into it. Okay, so let's start with a huge question, one we've been asking forever. Why do people commit crimes? The usual answers point to things like personal choice or morality or a person's character. But what if that's the wrong place to look? What if the real story isn't about the person at all, but about the path they were forced to walk?
And this, right here, is the absolute core of it. We're shifting the question. We stop asking why a person commits a crime, and we start asking how our own institutions, our schools, our healthcare system, our social services, are actually creating the pathways that lead people to crime. I mean, that's a total game changer, right?
Now, this whole new way of looking at things has a name. It's called biographical criminology. And what it does is it zooms out. Instead of just looking at the single moment a crime happens, it looks at the entire movie of a person's life to figure out how they got to that final scene.
So what this really means is that biographical criminology sees an encounter with the justice system not as the beginning of a problem, but as the predictable endpoint of a long journey. A journey that was marked by all these systematic failures. It's like the last stop on a train that was set in motion years, sometimes even decades earlier.
Let's just let that sink in for a second. The idea here isn't to investigate a person's criminal career. No. The goal is to investigate the institutional career of harm. In other words, we're looking at the long track record of failures by the very systems that were supposed to help people. The focus completely shifts from what's wrong with the person to what's wrong with the system.
And there's a term for this kind of systemic damage, biographical injury. Now, this isn't like a single event, like a broken arm that heals. It's more like a chronic illness. It's the slow, cumulative damage that builds up over a person's entire life from all these little failures and gaps in services, making them more and more vulnerable over time.
Okay, so you might be wondering, how does this biographical injury actually happen? How does this harm build up? Well, the theory says it happens through three main mechanisms that all work together, kind of creating this powerful downward spiral. Let's break those down.
First up, you've got temporal accumulation. Just picture a tiny snowball at the top of a hill. As it rolls, it doesn't stay small, right? It gets bigger and faster. That's what happens here. A small, unaddressed problem just compounds and multiplies over time. Second is institutional interconnection. It's basically a domino effect. A failure in one system, say healthcare, like an undiagnosed brain injury, directly knocks over a domino in another system, like education. And finally, there's biographical embedding. This one's deep. When a person is failed by institutions again and again and again, that experience of failure becomes part of who they are. It shapes their identity and their expectations for the future. They start to expect rejection.
Now, this might all sound a bit abstract, a bit theoretical, but these mechanisms have absolutely devastating real-world consequences. Let's take a look at how these institutional gaps create a very real, very predictable pipeline that leads straight from the classroom to the prison cell.
Let's just walk through a story that is tragically common. Picture a kid 7 years old who has an undiagnosed brain injury. It causes behavioral problems, but everyone just sees a bad kid who needs discipline. By the time they're 12, they've been kicked out of school multiple times. With no support and no real prospects, is it any surprise that by 18 they have their first conviction? It's not a shock. It's the inevitable end of a trajectory that started a decade earlier.
And look, that's not just a sad story. The data is absolutely staggering. Research shows that a whopping 74% of young offenders have experienced a head injury. This isn't a coincidence, folks. This is a symptom of a massive, unaddressed public health crisis that is colliding head-on with our justice system.
The sheer scale of this becomes crystal clear when you put the numbers side by side. In the general population, about 12% of people have had a traumatic brain injury. But in the prison population, that number skyrockets to 65%. Let's be real, this isn't about bad people. This is glaring evidence of a system that is completely failing to identify and support people with neurological needs, and instead is just funneling them straight into prison.
And these failures, they show up in different ways. You've got structural gaps, like mental health services that are just chronically underfunded. You've got transitional gaps. Think about a vulnerable young person in foster care who turns 18 and bam, all their support just vanishes overnight. And the result of all this? Look at care leavers. They make up just over 0.5% of the youth population, but they account for almost 1/4 of the adult prison population. That isn't a crack in this system. That's a catastrophic failure.
So, if we accept that the problem is so deeply rooted in these institutional failures, then the solution can't possibly be more of the same old punishment. This understanding forces us to look in a completely different direction, away from punishment and toward a new path, one that's all about prevention.
The criminologist Pat Carlin just nails it with this quote. Her point is that for so many people who end up in prison, this whole idea of rehabilitation is basically a fantasy. How can you restore someone to a state of stability and advantage that they never ever had in the first place?
And that leads us to a really important shift in language and in thinking. Instead of rehabilitation, this approach points us towards a new idea: habitation. It's subtle, but it's huge. It's not about fixing a broken person, it's about providing the fundamental building blocks of a stable life, things like education, healthcare, housing, that they were denied from the very beginning. It's about building, not rebuilding.
So what does this actually look like in practice? Well, it means some clear policy shifts. It means we have to move from just managing crises to providing early, sustained support. It means we can't just cut off help for vulnerable people the day they turn 18. It means our services need to be integrated to treat a whole person with a complex life, not just one single issue. And, so importantly, it means we have to formally recognize brain injury in our schools, so a health problem is never ever again treated as just a discipline problem.
Which brings us to one final, really powerful question. If we accept that crime is so often the predictable, logical outcome of our own systems failing people over and over throughout their lives, then where should we be putting our society's focus? Where should our resources truly be? On the punishment at the very end of the line, or on fixing the broken path that leads them there in the first place?